Welcome to You, Me, Empathy. Thank you for listening. We would like to remind you that this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Known as just a silly boy with a feely heart. Please consider supporting the show. Check us out on Patreon or simply leave a review on iTunes. Here's your host and creator of the show, Known Wells.
Greetings, empathy heroes. Welcome to You, Me, Empathy. My name is Known Wells, and this is episode 22. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for embracing empathy with me and for being a mental health awareness hero, which I know you are. So thank you for that. This episode, I chat with my friend Tony, the therapist. We explore the emotional and physiological impacts of sexual abuse. This is a follow-up episode to episode 21 with my friend Christina, who shared her story quite courageously and beautifully in her experience as a victim of ongoing sexual assault and abuse. So go check that out. If you haven't listened to that episode, it really is a must listen. So go back and listen to that. Before I get to the show, before you start listening to the show, I just wanted to call out some new Patreon supporters. Woohoo! You guys are the best. Brittany, Corey, Morgan, Carol, Courtney, all new Patreon supporters for You, Me, Empathy. I am elated and so giddy and excited that You, Me, Empathy is connecting with people, and you guys are supporting it. It means so much to me, and I so appreciate it. My heart is warmed and it's swelling, and you guys are the best. I love you, and so thank you for supporting You, Me, Empathy. You too, listeners, can support You, Me, Empathy if you like at Patreon, patreon.com/You, Me, Empathy. It's a place where you can support the show on an ongoing basis and get some fun rewards in return. Okay, that's it. That's all I'll say. Thank you so much for listening, and enjoy this episode 22, with Tony the therapist on sexual assault. Welcome to You, Me, Empathy, a podcast about exploring the struggles we face in our day-to-day lives as humans trying to get by on this wondrous and overwhelming pale blue dot. The intent of You, Me, Empathy is to talk openly, without judgment, about our neuroses, our mental illnesses, our shared anxieties and worries, to create a dialogue that is vulnerable and deeply human and empathetic, and to share that dialogue with others to inspire emotional and cognitive collaboration and insight so we can, hand in hand, break down the stigma that make us feel shame and guilt for struggling, for feeling our feelings, for being human. You, Me, Empathy is a safe place, a conversation between friends, a place to inspire the beauty in each of us. Today, I am happy to embark on another empathy journey with my friend Tony Romike for Tony Time.
Hey, Known.
Hey.
How are you, buddy?
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm all right.
That's good.
Yeah.
So today's episode is a follow-up to my chat with my friend Christina. And I first want to just mention to the listeners that you need to go back and listen to that episode. It's Christina was very courageous and in opening up her heart and sort of to me, and I was just really in awe of her story and just her bravery in telling her story. And so it's a dark one. You know, there's a trigger warning there. We talk about some pretty dark stuff. But I think ultimately it was a really healing conversation, and Christina is just someone I admire and really care for. So go back, listen to that episode. Before we get into that, Tony, just remind the listeners who you are and all that mumbo jumbo stuff.
All the mumbo jumbo. So my name is Anthony Remike, but I do go by Tony as a nickname. But my board knows me as Anthony Remike, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist here in the state of California, licensed through the Board of Behavioral Sciences, and that's license number LMFT 47805. And I'm also a certified sex addiction therapist through the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals, and I have a private practice in Tustin, California.
Great.
I think that's everything.
Yeah, awesome.
I think I've dotted my I's and crossed my T's.
Are you enjoying doing that every Tony time?
Yeah, it's wonderful. I get to, reflect on my journey.
Good. That's good. I'm happy.
Bring up the pain of grad school and tests and board exams.
Sounds terrible.
It's quite the wonderful reminder. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Anytime.
I appreciate that. Well,
Tony time.
Every Tony time.
Any Tony time.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, listeners, today we are going to talk about sexual abuse is really the topic. And I don't mean to be so on the nose about that, but that's what Christina and I mainly focused on and her experience with sexual abuse. And I guess my first question with Tony is, what's your experience with that in terms of your patient base?
Yeah, definitely a fair amount. And, thinking about that podcast, which I, again, freshly listened to last night, I feel like I just have to even get out is just wow.
Wow, yeah.
And you had said it today already, but just courageous. What a courageous act. And, I just kept thinking that through the whole podcast. And it was my second time going through it. And I was just maybe even more into it the second time as I was listening to it again, just, listening to Christina's story, hearing all that she went through. And I just, I had so many different emotions going through listening to her history and her life. But the courage to talk about it, the bravery to talk about it and share her story, I was so impacted by, and I know the listeners will be as well. And it was just such inspiring of hope, and obviously who she's become as a person and the work she's done and the fact that she's a survivor. And,
absolutely.
And this is survivable. And there's hope, and then also just all the other emotions. I mean, I had rage, I had anger, I had sadness and tears, and feelings of powerlessness, and I think invoked so many different emotions in me listening to it. So, which I think stories like this do. I think these types of stories and just hearing about, which again, if I reflect on my client base or a client base or anybody who's gone through this particular issue is, that fundamental betrayal of a parent,
right.
And granted in this case, step parent, but in Christina's perspective, parent.
Right.
And the, betrayals that people go through or have gone through as a result of these, primary caretakers in their inability to not only not caretake and not help the burgeoning self develop in such a way of safety and connection, and instead have to develop in the fundamental relationships of their lives with fear and hypervigilance and disconnection or disassociation to survive. It's heartbreaking. I mean, it's so absolutely heartbreaking.
It is the worst thing that can happen.
It's like the worst thing.
You are like I hearing her talk and her story, like I'm with you. Like I'm experiencing all of the emotions, anger and sadness, and I want to cry and I want to protect her and I want to beat the shit out of her stepdad. All these emotions, and I think that's an important part of this is that it's totally natural to have all those emotions at once.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. And be conflicted. Like even her, like experiencing this thing, like, and the things she did to just get through it and survive. Like there are so many, sort of great, and then also like, damaging emotional sort of things that she's learning to just get through it, and to have a parent put you through that, a child who has no real ability to fight back or speak up or has no option. Like it's so devastating, and I just don't.
Yeah, it's interesting, knowing the child's perspective and not having a voice, nor not having a voice, nor having people around who are perceptive enough or are either not paying enough attention to recognize what's happening. So kind of that idea of who's going to rescue me from this. I mean, who?
Right.
I can't. I mean, I'm in this case, I'm the child.
Right.
So who is the person who's going to be able to rescue me from this absolute horrible nightmare that is occurring? It's just the betrayal of innocence, the betrayal of that parent-child bond. It's so primary. It's such a broken primary relationship, and it's just it's devastating.
Yeah. So how do you how does, in your experience, when people have come to you and have had experiences like this, how do they first bring it to you? How are they positioning it? What is the sort of psychological sort of frame with which they bring it to you? Because I imagine it's, as we're saying with Christina, it's so brave to be able to talk about that, and it took her a long time to do that. So how has that been for your patients?
Well, I think, it's, listening to Christina's story and having, heard, many others, either, personally, professionally, or through readings and, various, forms of channels of different forms of communication, and just, hearing all the ways in which, people have experienced, this type of early childhood trauma. It's, I think, the thing more often than not, and I'm reflecting on Bessel's book again, which we reference here quite a bit. The Body Keeps the Score.
First name basis with Bessel.
Yeah, it's Bessel. We don't even go by Mr. Van der Kolk anymore.
No,
it's
that's right.
Just Bessel.
Bessie.
And which I think his book does a wonderful job of pointing out, client presentation and this idea that, it's either going to take the form maybe of a depression, maybe chronic depression, throughout a lifetime. Maybe it's chronic anxiety, paired with chronic depression. It's a lifetime of just, poor relationships, abusive relationships potentially, and or even addictions.
I see. So it's not like someone comes to you and says, I've been sexually abused. It's you sort of uncovering that over time.
Right. It's, and I think, again, it's not maybe that the person's not aware that they've been sexually abused.
Right.
It's generally that the adult presentation takes a different form.
Sure.
It generally takes the form of some other, mental health based type of, or relational based, issue. And the presentation or the, reporting issue is, generally, again, something, otherwise clinical in nature, whether it's, again, chronic relational problems, a broken relationship, abusive relationships. Why am I staying in abusive relationships? Addiction, now a developed history of addiction. And, I think early childhood attachment, breaches, wounds, traumas, things of this nature, are, set up those kind of foundational templates for, I think, some of these other clinical issues that we're talking about. And quite often, I would think most mental health practitioners would say that these are the type of presentations they're probably going to get in their office. And, so it's to your point, it's not going to be somebody generally coming in just saying, that I was sexually abused and I want to work on that.
Well, and is that also part of like how they're dealing with it, right? They like,
Sure.
Obviously not going through that experience, but I can maybe sort of empathize to a point where I feel like talking around it or
Sure.
not being able to even just put it into words and admit to myself that it happened.
Absolutely. Or even, I imagine that it wouldn't be uncommon for somebody to even say, I didn't put two and two together.
Yeah.
That's in this compartment over here, and I didn't know that was actually connected to this presenting issue.
Oh, interesting.
It's not a lack of knowing. It's just I didn't know. Like I didn't put two and two together, so to speak. And again, it's not uncommon for years and years and years and years and years and years of history to pass before somebody may come in with a clinical presentation and do work around that, in which maybe these types of, again, early childhood traumas may be uncovered. And it's just, it's through the process of assessment, through the process of treatment that, it's possible to get to these underlying issues. And, but yeah, probably not going to be the surface presentation.
When you get to a point with a patient and they do reveal that, what is your response?
Well, I think in this particular case, what I'm thinking of is you've just, with that question is that how important it is to understand what it is that you're dealing with. I think when somebody, has uncovered this type of early childhood experience, and because I think it's going to be so foundational to many aspects of life, and I'm certainly, one of the big ones I'm thinking about is relational.
Yeah. Yeah.
Trying to think about what would something like this do to, to that person and their relational experiences forward. And what would that, so how has that person protected themselves, right? How have they protected themselves? What is it they've done over their lifetime, perchance, to remain safe and yet attempt to be connected, maybe attempt to have relationships. And in thinking about that, I just think, trauma and trauma treatment, again, whether it's, through the wonderful book that obviously we just can't plug enough, but Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, or the work of Peter Levine, and people who have done a lot of work around trauma, and whether it's even in the form now of different theoretical orientations like we've touched on, whether it's sensory motor, whether it's somatic therapies, whether it's EMDR, whether it's some of these other trauma-based type of therapies. I think it's really important for people to get the appropriate type of therapy relevant to interventions that are really going to help, move them through maybe those early childhood traumas and really, kind of broken attachment experiences. Because, if there's been that form of early childhood abuse, particularly from a caretaker, a parent, and, think about the impact, that could have lifelong.
Right.
With, therefore, if you couldn't be safe with your parents, whom can you be safe with later in life? These are the people who were, the people entrusted with everything about your, growth and your mental well-being and your, development of bonding and connection and safety. And if that's been, fundamentally broken, think about the adaptive process that would have to come with that in terms of how am I going to make myself better, right?
Right.
I remember Christina talking about, that she, became a great student and she became a, kind of a high performance type of person. And, again, I'm not going to draw the parallels to say that's directly, correlated or related, since she's obviously not my client and I've never treated her. But, in just thinking about the different ways in which people might try and adapt to something to survive and get themselves through life, could take various forms. And, and potentially in worst case scenarios, that might be abusive relationships and addiction and maybe even severe mental health. So.
Yeah, I mean, I even said, like, obviously I'm not a professional, but I said to Christina in that conversation that it made logical sense to me when she said, "Oh, I realized that this environment, I was going to be put in that position that was terrifying and dangerous and traumatic, and so I'm going to put myself in another environment and try to be there as often as possible." That makes
Sure.
total sense to me.
Yeah, and as you and I have touched on through many of our podcasts, the essence of survival is just always so shocking and surprising to me in a good way, meaning the things we do to survive and to adapt and to cope through whatever it is that we've been challenged with, and whatever types of traumas and horrible things that have happened to us and that we've gone through, but survived. And so whatever it is somebody may have adapted to survive, I have the greatest amounts of compassion for. And when they can talk about those experiences, again, my understanding, my acceptance, my compassion for, their survival and whatever form that may have taken is a, kind of understandable, expected, type of response. And looking back or, sitting with the person in the current and being able to think in terms of how to move them forward, understanding that, you did what you had to do.
Yeah.
And if that might not work for you any longer, that, may have been, a form of adaptation that you needed to survive whatever you had experienced. And at some point must have worked for you. At some point, there certainly must have been a very important reason that worked. It's just not working any longer. It's not allowing you to be the relationally healthy, connected person, or relationally satisfied person that you're longing to be, and helping somebody get back to that place or get to that place maybe for the first time ever. So it's certainly gives you again a deep sense of compassion for whatever adaptive type of strategy somebody created to survive.
Yeah,
and I mean that survive. I mean it's. We go back to that here quite a bit, and we talk about survival and the necessity of safety and the necessity of forming healthy, attached relationships, and that being such a cornerstone of, healthy mental health.
Yeah.
Wow. Healthy mental health.
That works.
All right.
And if you don't have that, you do what you can to make it work. You do what you can.
You do. I mean, that's, my understanding of the work that I do, it's like people are doing what they could do.
Yeah.
And whatever it was, I don't care how maladaptive it now looks, it somehow served a big purpose and was important in survival and adaptation. And, it's sometimes we do, things that might be hard to understand, but at some point it must have been really successful and helpful.
Yeah. And we as people who experience these things, and I know that Christina had mentioned that she experienced this as well, is even if we know that, retrospectively, we know that we did this thing, we operated in this way to survive, there's still like a lack of kindness toward ourselves in that, in the guilt and the self-hatred. Talk about that, sort of those components to sexual abuse or sexual trauma.
Yeah, it's just so heartbreaking.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think, when I think of that, I think of just like the damage to the soul, that some of these early childhood experiences can bring somebody. And it's fascinating. I find it very fascinating that, part of, I don't know if it's adaptation, maybe partly, and if you think about it from even kind of like a psychodynamically or object relations oriented kind of perspective, which maybe, lost on some people who are listening to this, but basically an understanding from kind of a post-psychoanalytic perspective, so post-Freudian therapy, where we started to really accept and understand what basically was the impact of early childhood relationships on psychopathology. And what we started, traditional psychoanalysis, from my understanding, was very much focused on individual functioning, individual, drives within the person. And there were some, psychosexual type of perspectives, obviously, particularly within Freudian psychology and so forth. But even those were kind of intrapsychically within the person kind of based. But later we started to understand what's the impact of our social settings and what's the impact and significance of our relational experiences. And through, wonderful people, like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, who ended up giving us attachment theory and, the different forms of attachment that we may experience. And through, work of, Winnicott and his wonderful work and Margaret Mahler. And, all the way up now to a lot of the neuroscience work that we're doing and really understanding how the brain forms in context of social relational experiences, the work of Dan Siegel and Alan Shore and many other great people who are really helping us understand the fundamental significance and necessity of those early childhood experiences. And then again, if we add on the people of, Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine and others who do trauma work and understanding, the outcome for an individual if there have been problems in those early attachment experiences and, the way the brain can actually form around those things and the, either, move towards type of approach or move away type of approach that people could develop. It's really fascinating again to understand how the brain and how that survival part of us is developed and the way, structurally, so to speak, that forms within each one of us and creates, some of the long-term problems, that we're talking about in terms of psychopathology. So whether there's been a breach, because of sexual abuse, whether there's been a breach because a parent was substance abuse, it was abusing substances and addicted, whether there was mental health issues, whether there was chronic threat of poverty, chronic threat of violence, anything that really potentially disrupted that early attachment, bonding, safety, connective, nurturing, attuned type of experience. I think it's safe to say that, we can potentially create all kinds of adaptations, and survival-based functions to, basically do just that, to, survive. And whether, adaptation that requires, I'm thinking, my back's kind of been tweaked the last couple of weeks. And I really need to get into the chiropractor. And now I'm kind of feeling it, in my hip. And, even my knee was hurting earlier this week. And it's interesting because if in fact this actually started in my back, but now that it's kind of trickled its way all the way down, my muscular skeletal system, it's kind of really impacted on my whole system.
Yeah,
and it's probably because I'm walking different or I'm leaning different.
Yeah, and you have a slight imbalance.
I have a slight imbalance, and I'm
favoring it.
I'm favoring it, so therefore I'm kind of getting the rest of my body kind of out of alignment. And, I kind of see it like that. It's like there's this initial injury or wound that occurs.
Interesting.
And, we adapt emotionally and psychologically. And then, the whole system over time somewhat becomes out of balance. But we just kind of keep it, I'll just carry the shoulder a little higher.
Yeah.
I'll just, lean. And this is all unconscious, right? I mean, this isn't, we're not choosing to walk or lean this particular way. It's just happening.
Right.
And, all of a sudden, it's, from my shoulder all the way down to my knee, hasn't got to the ankle or the foot yet, but probably if I wait another couple of weeks, it will. So I find that very similar, kind of as a metaphor.
That's helpful to me actually, because I've been in that position myself where I've had injuries and to sort of work through the pain. I'm like,
do people know you were like a high level soccer player? Do they know what a soccer stud you were? I don't know if you've ever.
This isn't Yumi soccer.
This is Yumi soccer. Okay.
This is Yumi empathy.
In case the listeners didn't know, he was quite the soccer player.
I played soccer for many years. Yes. But yeah, so I've had many injuries in my life and have been in a place where I've felt pain and therefore I'm favoring one side and then that can impact other areas. That makes total sense.
Yeah.
I mean, because the mental stuff, the unseen,
right.
It's hard to have a frame of mind or just like a framework to understand how things impact us.
Right.
And so that's helpful.
Yeah, because, I think, again, so much of this is happening out of our awareness. We're not consciously making choices to say, I think an anxiety disorder here would work really well. So I think I'm going to go ahead and create, a worry-based, fear-based system. It's...
That would be interesting
right.
if we reacted that way. But
right.
We do not.
Yeah, and we do not. But it shows up.
Yeah.
And it, as does, maybe a depression, as does, maybe even substance use and maybe alcohol use and maybe overspending or maybe indulging in sex and, thinking at first like, this kind of helps, when I go to that party and I've had a couple drinks before I get in, or maybe once I'm there, I'm a little more social and maybe I'm not thinking about the stress of the week, or maybe I'm not thinking about the pain I'm kind of experiencing or depression or anxiety. And then, it's fairly easy to want to slip into that again, maybe at another time and do the same thing. And, if that becomes, chronic enough, you potentially could adapt, a dependence, and or addiction. And, when that happens, we never know, and it's virtually, very different for every person. But again, it starts off as something very innocent. It doesn't start off of like, hey, I want to grab this beer, and I really hope in 2 years I'm a full blown, alcoholic, because that would be awesome. It just starts off as, wow, it was really great. That beer really made me feel good. It just alleviated a lot of pain. I feel like now we're starting to see a lot of that with video gaming and gaming in general.
What do you mean?
Just the same thing, it's just how enjoyable it is to sit down and lose yourself maybe in a game or even lose yourself in the internet and just check out, completely just lose yourself. I know, I've sat down with the internet and had one thing specifically I'm searching for, and 3 hours later I'm in, automotive repair of a, 66 Chevy Nova. And, I'm like, I was looking up, does fluoride, actually exist in our water or something? I don't know.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I'm so far away and I feel like it's been 20 minutes and it's, been 2 hours and I've just completely zoned out and checked out and I just wasn't present. I mean, simply wasn't present. And I think, people are finding themselves doing and spending more time in those types of behaviors, disconnecting and being very much in a different, almost kind of just a very disconnected type of experience, almost somewhat dissociative. And it's a place where we're not feeling, right? If you're spending 3, 4, 5 hours in a game, you're not self-connected, right? Mm-hmm. You're not in a place of self-awareness. You're very much in a very, very different place. So
disassociating, disconnecting, those you would say are common coping mechanisms or symptoms of someone who's experienced a trauma like sexual abuse?
Certainly can. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly one of the things that somebody can adapt.
What are some others?
Compulsive use of substances or shopping or spending, anything that may take us out of, our present current mood and put us into a different mood state, something that could serve to numb, something that could serve to give us a form of escape. And, fantasy can be used for that as well. And, and that fantasy can take many forms. I mean, it could losing ourselves in our own thoughts, losing ourselves in chronic daydreaming, it can even take that form. You can lose yourself in a book, right? You can lose yourself in fantasy. You can lose yourself in a great piece of fiction. You can lose yourself in gaming, as we've talked about, and substances, substances, obviously, drugs. I mean, we have such an opioid, abuse occurring in our nation at this point. It's, I've been reading and, different articles on that. And it just seems like what a severe health crisis we have is it's relating to opiates and death. And I don't have the statistics, but I was reading some recently and I was just shocked and floored at the opiate, epidemic. So prescription drugs. I mean, we're talking about the actual prescription drugs. I hear anecdotally, so I don't know if it's accurate, but I hear, heroin's on the rise. which would make sense because, I hear that people can switch from the prescription painkillers to heroin if it's certainly cheap enough.
I mean, this is an anecdote, obviously, but that's what happened to Harris Whittles.
Oh, that's right.
He went from opiates and, he was basically said to his sister Stephanie, who wrote this amazing book called Everything is Horrible and Wonderful, you should absolutely read. He said basically opiates, he just was having to take so much of them and they were expensive and heroin was cheap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what you hear. And, it's just horrible, I mean, once people, make some of those transitions, just knowing the depth of their addiction, you know, and just knowing the severity of it. And it's just such a, powerful drug, obviously, as are others. But, and even so getting back to disconnection, disassociation, and there's various levels of dissociation. I mean, in various forms that it can take.
Well, some of it, would you say some of it is of value?
Oh,
it's just about balance, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, right, exactly. I mean, a lot of it's about balance and to what degree.
To what degree, yeah.
Do we do something like this? I mean, I think we all do it. I mean,
yeah.
Have you ever driven down the street and you're like, where was I that last mile?
Sure.
You're like.
But I love to get lost in a book, right? And there's value in that.
Oh,
but,
absolutely.
there's balance and to what degree as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, with anything, I think what we're always looking for clinically is, is there an impact to your life based upon how much use you're doing with anything,
right.
Whether it's, book reading and, if you are no longer getting up to go to work because you can't get out of your book or you're failing other, normal social basic responsibilities in your life, you're not cooking, you're not cleaning, you're not, grooming, or there's failures in your relationships because you're choosing not to participate, and you're spending all your time in, again, gaming, internet, book reading. This can take so many different forms, but, again, how much of something, right? How much of something is somebody doing? But I think even disassociation initially is a very, not healthy thing. It's something that a lot of people have required and needed, particularly in the face of early childhood trauma, where there's been, abuse of some form that's happening. And maybe their way to survive and to cope with what was happening to them was, disassociation, disconnection. Again, anecdotally, you hear about people who have experienced, rape or a wartime type of scenario. And they even talk about like, I was out of my body. Like I don't even know where I was. That was somebody else that was happening to. That wasn't me. And again, certainly that is the brain creating a way for that person to survive what's happening to them.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, I am going to completely check out of this so I can keep living, because otherwise what's happening to me is greater than my ability to manage it.
Right.
And, and ultimately that's trauma, that something is happening to me that's greater than my ability to be able to cope and to understand and accept what's happening. And, so again, it's part of our built-in defense mechanisms. It's part of our survival, part of us that allows us to survive these horrible things. But if we don't get the opportunity to heal through that post the experience, that's again where something like this can become a chronic condition. And that's what you hear about when you think about post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, where, substance abuse or other forms of addiction might be comorbid with that. And certainly in where a anxiety-based and or depressive-based type of clinical presentation can also be present with something like that as well. So, but it's, again, very survival-based.
How do you heal after an experience like that? Something that Christina experienced.
Yeah. Wow.
I know it's everyone is different, but what are some of the sort of broad strokes that maybe you have worked on with some of your clients?
Yeah, it's such a great question. You're right. I mean, so many things kind of flooded into my mind, in thinking about, people who are having to deal with, a trauma-based early childhood, experience and thinking that, really kind of reflecting back on maybe some of the other interventions that we've kind of talked about, where EMDR can be potentially very helpful, where somatic-based interventions and therapy can be so helpful, where people can get back to, sensory-based, where it's, as Bessel will talk about and the other people will talk about, it feels like there's a lot of movement in the area of trauma treatment that is moving away from, I think what it was maybe 20 years ago and earlier, where you've got to get somebody to talk about their trauma. You've got to get them to be able to, go back and process and reprocess until there's not the impact of their experiences any longer. And I think, again, Bessel does a great job in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, in knowing that, thank goodness, research appears to be showing that that's not the most effective form of treatment. It might even be re-traumatizing. And instead, it might be some of these other, or potentially they're getting good benefits from other forms of interventions that are helping people learn to be present today with themselves. It's helping them reconnect with themselves in the present and helping them build a part of themselves, kind of an internal resourcing, if you will, of their ability to be connected to themselves in such a way where it's not overwhelming, like it was, or there's not the information, inside of themselves that they weren't connected to as they were before. Because again, part of this disconnection or dissociation is losing that connection with yourself. So, bringing that back in and learning to, trust your intuition, being able to trust that this is a creepy person, or being able to trust your intuitions of, I shouldn't be touched here, or I shouldn't be treated this way. And allowing them to know that intuitively inside of themselves, to be able to set healthy boundaries. I think people who have experienced this type of early trauma, can potentially have a very difficult time being able to be, self-connected and self-aware enough to know this doesn't feel right for me and I don't want to accept this.
Yeah.
And or to be able to set healthy boundaries, to be able to say, this is not okay for me and I won't accept this. And to have that permission, we've talked about that kind of empowered place of having a voice, to be able to have permission to be self-protective.
Yeah.
To have permission to be able to say, I can say no, or I can leave this situation. I don't have to stay here. I can do something different. I can be empowered. I can be assertive. And, I think some people even take, karate classes and self-defense classes, to feel empowered, to feel...
It's pronounced karate.
Karate. Pardon me.
I don't really know.
My faux pas. But just, these really cool things to just really, I think, help people, feel empowered and self-connected. And we've talked about mindful-based, activities quite a bit, which I think is a huge part of this. Psychopharmacological interventions can potentially be helpful as well, through an evaluation and assessment with a qualified psychiatrist. And
potentially medication?
And potentially medication, okay. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, as well as, traditional psychotherapy, which is, again, the potential for a, relationally based experience in which the person can find safety and validation for their experiences and help them, get in touch with. It seems so helpful at times when people get to be seen, heard, particularly because they weren't, and to be able to to be able to sit with somebody and normalize and validate their pain or their hurt or the fact that they weren't seen or that they weren't rescued, or going back to something you talked about earlier, which was, this wasn't my fault.
Right.
Like I was a child.
Right.
This, what happened to me was not my responsibility. I was not complicit in this. There's no accuracy to this. I do not need to carry that belief with me, which is very difficult to heal, by the way. I mean, it takes time. But it's to have somebody, again, be able to validate and normalize and to be able to give permission to those things that, as a child, they didn't get.
Right.
They didn't get, and unfortunately carried, potentially many inaccurate thoughts and statements and beliefs that, can also play a huge part in some of these other manifestations that we've talked about, guilt, shame, which certainly can lead to anxiety-based, depression-based type of disorders. So yeah. But again, there's hope.
There is hope.
and it's, we always talk about that here, that there's, I mean, that's why we do this podcast, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
It's about that, bringing hope to people to understand that, there's resources.
We're
right?
listening.
We're listening.
We
There's
hear
resources, and that, and again, I was thinking about that with Christina's, podcast, and just thinking like, wow, like what potentially is her courage bringing other people who maybe have not yet, started their work on this, or or are wondering about, I was just so thankful again of her courage and her ability to talk so openly and take such a vulnerable risk in sharing this with you and our listeners, and just what a wonderful thing to even help other people who might potentially know somebody or might be dealing with this themselves.
Right.
So thankful for that.
I'm very thankful for that, and I it's just a wonderful perspective to have to, experience the thing and then have the courage to speak about that thing in the hopes of, and I know Christina has this, in the hopes of helping others and creating that
absolutely
potential connection for others to maybe make one positive step forward.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what a just absolutely wonderful thing that, again, just must have taken so much courage and so much bravery and risk but I'm just, so thankful for her and what she was willing to share.
Good job, Christina.
Yeah, great job.
And listeners, if you haven't listened to that episode, or even if you have, go back and listen to it. Just a tremendous story. And just reiterating that. Yeah,
I mean, like I said, I've had the opportunity now to go through it twice and just, I'll probably go through it again. I mean, honestly, I think it's just such a... there was so much there. I feel like, I want to give it even more experience and by listening to it again, and just because I think, I pick up different things at different times, obviously depending on where I'm at. And,
sure.
And there's just so much there, but just, really amazing.
Cool. Well, I think that is good for this episode of Tony Time. Thanks for listening, guys. Again, go back, listen to that episode with Christina. And just remember that there's hope, that there are people out there that have stories like yours, and you have the ability and capacity to take that step forward. And even though it can be difficult, and it will, there are people in your life that will help you through it. Absolutely. So, I guess that's it. I want to thank Tony for being here.
Always my pleasure. Thank you, Known.
You're very welcome.
All right.
And as always, I'm here, you're here. We're here together on this wayward, overwhelming, awe-inspiring pale blue dot. We have each other. It's you, me, empathy.